Welcome to the MAAWG Engagement Series. My name is Amy Cadigan, and I am MAAWG's Executive Director. MAAWG is a trusted environment. What happens at MAAWG stays at MAAWG. During this webinar, there is no photography, no video, no audio recording, and no screen capturing allowed. MAAWG prohibits the use of AI-enabled translation and transcription services. This webinar has been approved for recording by MAAWG. The recording will be posted on the MAAWG Engagement Series homepage on the members-only portion of the MAAWG website. Please treat everyone with respect. MAAWG is dedicated to making our meetings and business open to all members and guests while making it a safe place for all. Reminders for our worldwide friends. I would like to cover a few housekeeping items before our webinar begins. If you have any technical issues, questions, or concerns about this webinar, please send a private chat message to the panelists. Please submit your questions via the Q&A box. You will find the button on the Zoom bar at the bottom of the screen. All questions will be taken at the end of the webinar. If chat is enabled during this webinar, please keep the chat productive and be courteous to all participants. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoy the webinar.
Yeah, welcome everybody. Yeah, thank you for joining the M3 engagement series from MAAWG. Today, we have a very hot topic, a topic that many of our members have been asking for, that is basically SMS blasters. And I don't think there is a better person than Roger to cover that. Roger Piqueras-Joubert is a recognized leader in mobile security and fraud prevention, with over 15 years of experience across research and engineering. He's been working on a wide variety of security initiatives on the telco space, like researching vulnerabilities in LTE networks and also vulnerabilities on 2G. He's been working on enterprise security, and Google and Meta, always working on this security space. During his time at Android at Google, he worked on many different things, and he led the effort to allow users to disable 2G connections. That is very related to this talk. He's currently working at Meta, as I said, working on security and making social network even safer. And today, as I said, he will cover SMS blasters, how protocol limitations in mobile networks are abused today to propagate scams and fraud. So Roger, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today, and thank you for being here, and thank you, Alberto, for the introduction. I'm going to talk about SMS blasters, which is a topic that I've been following very closely for a couple of years now, and that it's the first time in my career where I've seen a very close correlation between these things that I will be talking about in terms of like security for mobile networks and fraud and things that affect day-to-day users. You've already introduced me, so there's not much for me to say. I'll just say that right now I'm at Meta. I'm not working in this topic, but throughout my career, I've always been working on like mobile security, either on the side or as a full-time job. As of today, my full-time job is not in this area, so like none of the things I'll be discussing today have anything to do with things I do at Meta. This is like standard disclosure that I do, but it's very much related to things that I've been doing for many years in the past at Android and previous places. So with that, I just wanted to kind of like start setting a bit like the context for this. When I talk about these topics and I refer to mobile security, and in this case, in the context of SMS blasters, I refer to what I think of as the state of the art in security and privacy of cellular connectivity for mobile devices. This is specifically when your like Android, iOS devices or other devices connect to a cellular network in particular. This is nothing to do with like Wi-Fi or other connectivity. This is particularly when your device is connecting over 2G, 3G, 4G, or 5G. Over the years, There's been a lot of action in this space. There's been a lot of researchers who've investigated the state of the art of security and privacy in this area. Back in GSM or 2G, there was a bunch of researchers that essentially demonstrated live how GSM uses outdated encryption. It's not outdated encryption. It wasn't outdated encryption when the protocol was launched, but like by today's standards, like the encryption of GSM or 2G can be broken fairly easily. But most importantly, there was no mutual authentication. The phone made sure it was connecting with the right network. The network made sure the phone was the right phone and the right person, but the phone didn't check that it was talking with the real network. So it was trivial to set up a false base station or a false network. I'm not sure why, and I've given talks about this in other places, but 3G was mostly skipped, so people didn't look too much into it, although it had stronger encryption and most importantly introduced mutual authentication. And then in 4G, we had even stronger encryption. We continued having mutual authentication, but there was a number of issues that were identified even in that protocol by a lot of researchers. I mentioned them here and myself. And then by the time 5G was deployed, globally, or started being deployed in certain parts of the world, this research area, security, was so kind of like popular that there was lots of groups looking into it, and there was people finding issues with the 5G protocol even before 5G was being deployed. There's a lot of things I could tell you about this space. There's only one particular thing that is important for like SMS Blaster, so I'm going to try to keep it very specific. This gets a bit technical, but at the same time, it's covered at a very high level. And it's essentially me trying to explain why SMS blasters can do what they do so easily. This is a message flow of what happens when, for example, if you're riding the subway and get out of the subway, your phone connects to the network, or what happens when you have your phone on airplane mode and you disable airplane mode, or when you turn on your phone the first time. This is essentially what happens between your phone and the network before. You can see a blue arrow at the bottom, before like the first actual bits of data can be sent in either direction. Doesn't matter what, you don't have to look at these messages. The important part is that there's a lot of things that happen between the phone and the towers, and also like the nodes of the core network, which are things that are, in the backbone of the network. The important part is that all the messages that fly between that go communicate wirelessly between the phone and the base station are sent, they have no protection whatsoever. These are messages that can be intercepted and can be tampered with. But most importantly, there's a subset of these that have no cryptographical protection of any kind. And I'm going to explain a bit more what do I mean by this. This is, and again, no need to look into every single detail here. This is essentially a actual capture of LTE, in this case LTE traffic, of a phone going between, the traffic going between a phone and a base station on LTE, from the point that the phone starts connecting to the point that it starts sending data. At the bottom, you can see that there's ciphered data and ciphered like a signaling traffic. So at that point, things are encrypted, and me, when I took this capture as a passive observer in the middle, I don't know what's happening. Things are encrypted, but you can see that before that happens, there's a number of things that I see what they are. It doesn't matter what these messages are, but like the important point here is that there's a lot of messages before things get encrypted that are sent in the clear. I can see everything. And the important part is that these messages, not only they are not sent in the clear, but they don't have any means of integrity protection. So I could like capture these messages and replay them, modify them, and neither end of the communication would be able to tell that this is happening. And essentially, what I'm trying to convey here is that regardless of the authentication and encryption that your devices use, which is very strong, whether it's 2G, 3G, 4G, and 5G, all mobile devices will engage on a substantial exchange of messages with any base station, whether it's malicious or not, that doesn't matter, that advertises itself with the right broadcast. So like base stations are constantly broadcasting these messages saying like, hey, I'm an LTE base station from, say, I don't know, Verizon. I'm a 5G base station from AT&T. I'm a 5G base station from like Movistar. So this is how they operate, and this is how the phone sees these base stations and connects to them. But these messages, these broadcast messages, have no cryptographical protection, no integrity protection, no digital signatures, no nothing. So anybody can be broadcasting these messages, and mobile devices will believe that they are truthful. So essentially, The way I've always kind of described it is comparing it, this is how I try to bring it to something that people are more familiar. People who are not, don't have expertise in mobile security will understand what I'm trying to say. So I compare it to my laptop login to Gmail. When I go to gmail.com, I see a page that is asking me to do something that has some security sensitivity to it, which is typing my username and password. But at that point, I know that that's the real Gmail page, for example, because the content of that page has been signed with a key, and then there's a certificate that is attesting the validity of that key that my browser can verify. There's no such thing in Salware. You see a tower that advertises to be a carrier, like whether it's Verizon, AT&T, it's the same with all carriers, but there's no way for you to verify that that's indeed truthful. So in cellular, when your phone is connecting to a base station, it's essentially the same thing as accepting a self-signed certificate in the browser world. There is something that is claiming to be a carrier. In the case of the browser world, will be something claiming to be Gmail, and you have no way of verifying that's true. You just connect to it. So every time your phone connects to a tower, whether it's 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, and no matter what carrier, the phone is essentially accepting a self-signed certificate. And there's some risk to it. The risk is that over the last decade, there's been a number of attacks or vulnerabilities identified that essentially abuse these messages, which I refer to, or people usually refer to as pre-authentication messages. All those messages we saw earlier that happen before things are encrypted and protected, those are messages that are completely exposed, that you can try to abuse, replay, you can act as a base station from any carrier, and any mobile device will believe that you are indeed that carrier, up to the point where you start doing the security handshake that derive keys to then start encrypting things. And these messages that happen before that point can be abused for many ways and many types of attacks. This is fascinating. If anybody is interested in this space, you should look into it. There's many interesting things and scary things that can be done abusing these messages. The one that I want to talk about today, because it's highly relevant with how SMS blasters operate, is when I came up with this trick many years ago. I was not the first one, but when I came up to this with this trick, I called it silent downgrade to 2G. But it's essentially, there is a way in which I can downgrade any phone's connection to 2G without the user being aware of it. That's why I refer to it as silent. To explain how this works, I need to talk a bit about how mobile protocols work. There is a number of scenarios in which a carrier would prefer or need or require devices not to connect to, for example, LTE or 5G. This can happen in scenarios where, I don't know, a classic one in terms of excess of load would be what I refer to as the New Year's Eve, effect. At midnight, everybody texts everybody they know saying Happy New Year. So there's a lot of load in the network. There's different scenarios in which a network could be, deciding that they don't want to have that much traffic going into their 5G or 4G network, for example. And there's a lot of other edge cases, but this is one that I usually use as an example. When this occurs, what is happening in the background is that your device will try to connect to the network. And there's different flows in which this can happen. It can happen when you're updating what area in the network you are in, which is called traffic area update process, or when the phone is connecting to the network. But essentially, it all boils down to the fact that the phone is trying to continue connectivity using these messages that are not encrypted or protected. And then the network replies with a message saying, no, you're not allowed to do this because, in this case, the code that uses EPS services not allowed. So essentially, the network is telling the device, you're not allowed to connect to LTE or 5G, so you'll have to figure out something different. And in that case, the phone what will do is downgrade the connectivity to 2G. This is a capture of me replicating this attack. It's a capture from many years ago, actually. But this is essentially trivial to do with open source tools. This is, in case this sounds very sophisticated, this is something you can do trivially with open source tools and very cheap radios. And this capture is from 2015, I believe. So the tools and the ability to do this has matured a lot over the years. So now it's very easy to find tutorials online that would tell you with no knowledge in this and just a couple $100, a few $100 of budget to be able to set up this. And you can set it up wherever you want, and then you can start downgrading phones to connect to 2G. It is important to note here that this would be against FCC regulations. You're not supposed to transmit anything on those frequencies or those bands unless you're a carrier. But anyways, what I'm trying to convey here is that it's very, very easy to silently downgrade phones to 2G. So here is where, if I lost anybody with the technicalities and the those like messaging flows charts and whatnot, is where I go into what you probably are more interested, which is like fraud. When I talk about these things, this sounds very cool, very interesting, very researchy, but how does this matter in the real world? And here's where, like, usually in my talks I pivot in two directions. One would be at-risk users and how these type of attacks are abused in certain ways that are not good. But in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pivot towards fraud. So how does this matter in the real world is SMS blasters. SMS blasters are essentially a false base station that abuses all these things that I just discussed for fraud, essentially for SMS phishing. Sounds pretty simple, but it's actually highly effective and profitable, and it's becoming a big, big problem. I'll be talking about this. So I was just mentioning how you can do these attacks with like open source tools and cheap radios. But for something like fraud, it's easy to find online these tools that they sell themselves, they advertise themselves as SMS blasters. They essentially, this is the name they have when you buy them, and they can be bought lawfully in many places. And I'll just mention that there's a couple of like efforts in different parts of the world where they are trying to like ban importing these tools into those countries, because usually they come from the same couple of places where they manufacture these tools. But think of a tool that costs between $5,000 to $10,000 or euros, and kind of automates these with a very nice and easy to use interface maybe from a smartphone or from the tool itself. But anyways, the SMS Blaster is abusing these things for SMS phishing. That's it. Very simple. This is something that had never been seen outside of mainland China, at least publicly reported, until late 2022. But ever since then, it's exploding. There's this site here. The link is at the bottom. You can go there. There's a dashboard that this news source that ComsRisk curates, that keeps track of all the instances of SMS blasters that have been reported worldwide. And this screenshot, by the way, is from when I started preparing the deck about a month ago, and there's been at least 2 or 3 more instances ever since. So this is even not up to date. But essentially, this started happening globally, all over the place. It hasn't been reported in places like the US yet, which I believe would pick up a lot of media attention when it happens, but it's happened in a lot of places, and there's been a lot of media coverage about it. So this is something that you can like find local news from these places and see how these things were reported, and specifically how the fraud happened uniquely in each one of them. I'm going to cover a few examples so you see essentially how this happens. So SMS blasters, as I said, they're essentially used to send phishing SMSs with one of these false base stations. And the way this works is the following. Essentially, somebody, a fraudster or whoever is like operating the device, goes to some crowded area carrying a false base station. This is not always static. There's been cases in which this was a person driving through a large city. In some cases, they're just static. In some cases, just move. But essentially, just think of somebody going to a crowded area with one of these devices. And these devices have 2 radios or 2 false base stations, one that is a 2G radio and one that is a 5G or LTE radio. There's been cases of these carried in the trunk of a car. We've seen these being carried in a backpack. These devices can be very small. We've seen different scenarios. At that point, the users who are walking or driving around that area, their phones essentially attempt to connect to the 5G or LTE fake base station. This can be achieved in many ways. There's many well-known techniques, well-investigated techniques. The simplest one is essentially crank up a lot of power. If you're transmitting a lot of power, a lot of devices will connect there. But there's also a bunch of like more stealth tricks in which you don't have to transmit that much power, so it's harder to find these devices, and then you can actually get a lot of devices to connect to you. And this is not rocket science. This is something that has been plenty of research and plenty of findings in this area. And these devices just automate these techniques for you, and you have a nice user interface for the person operating the device on a smartphone, for example. And then the attack, let's call it, is very simple. Once a phone tries to connect to the 5G or LTE base station, you just simply downgrade them to 2G, nothing else. You just like immediately reject the connection and tell the device connect to 2G. And then when the phone connects to 2G, it connects to the 2G radio from the same device. And then, very importantly, it's a key piece here is that 2G false base station is setting up the encryption at the cellular layer to a null cipher. This is a long story, but essentially cellular connectivity like 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, there's encryption happening over the air. When I showed earlier that message flow, you saw at the end that there was messages being encrypted. There's different ciphers that can be used for each one of the generations of the Gs. But each one of them supports what it's called a null cipher, which is essentially not encrypting. This is should only be used in like certain extreme circumstances when the network is recovering from an outage or like something is being debugged and whatnot. It doesn't happen that much in the wild anymore, but there is plenty of history of researchers finding commercial networks that do not encrypt traffic, which is not good. This is like research from like a few years ago. But essentially, the cipher has to be set up to a null cipher because then for the fake base station, for this device to be able to send an SMS to the phone, it does not need to know any encryption keys. There's inside of your SIM card, there's a secret identifier and there's a secret key. And using this secret key, you derive what is called a session key. That is the one that you would use to encrypt, for example, SMSs on 2G. Because you're setting the cipher to null cipher, SMS payloads are sent in the clear. So the device doesn't need to know any key material from your SIM card, and it can just simply send SMSs. So this is an important critical piece, and I'll get back to it later. And then once the phone is connected to 2G using a null cipher, the false base station just sends an SMS phishing, and immediately just drops the connection, so the user goes back to the actual cellular network. And a key piece here is that these messages, the SMSs, do not traverse the network. If you're, say, a Verizon subscriber, these SMSs never go through Verizon's network. Verizon doesn't see them. These SMSs go straight from this false base station into the phone. And then this gives you a tactical advantage that I'll mention it later, that like you can make them very, local aware or local specific, for example, because you know that you are in the same location as the user. So how has this been abused over the years? I remember when I read this news a long, long time ago, somebody sent me this and said, hey, that sounds like something you would be interested in. And I was like, oh yeah. There was a picture in this news story of a trunk of a car open with like a thing with a lot of antennas that they thought it was a bomb and they destroyed, but it turned out to be an IMSI catcher. This was the very first time that there was a public report of an SMS Blaster, a false base station being used in the wild, for non-law enforcement applications outside of mainland China. And essentially, the story goes that I think it was like late December 2022, police in Paris arrested somebody who was like, I think they were like drunk or something. Anyways, they were intoxicated inside of a car, sleeping, and they found a lot of equipment with antennas in the car, and they thought it was a bomb, and it turned out to be a radio. And anyways, they started pulling from the thread, and a carrier in France got involved in helping law enforcement investigate these, and it turned out to be an SMS Blaster. And they uncovered a campaign that made people lose a lot of money. I think I remember it was something about like the French kind of like health ministry or something was sending a message, you needed to update your information. Anyways, people lost a lot of money with this. And it was the first time that we saw these outside of mainland China. Shortly after, it's November 2023, there was this other instance where a citizen of another country was caught driving around Norway, carrying an SMS Blaster in the trunk. The only reason why they were caught was because they drove very close to a very important government building in Norway that had some sort of like a defense system that would like detect radios and things like that. And that's how they were caught. Otherwise, they would just have continued driving and sending SMS messages and phishing. There was never report of the type of fraud that was, or the type of phish these messages were, and how much money people lost. But this was another one that got a lot of attention. At this point, I remember after the case in Norway is when things exploded, and you would get one of these news stories like every other week globally. I really recommend this news site. It's called Comtrisk. It's highly specialized on communication, fraud, and security. I usually use it to kind of like get my source of news, and from their news, there's always links to the local news there, so you can have you can then go to the source of what the information is from. I remember asking a friend of mine from Vietnam to translate something for this one, but this was essentially a bunch of gangs had been caught driving around in cars with SMS blasters. I remember this one, they did share estimates of money lost and specifics on the fraud, but this was a pretty large campaign. There was also another case in New Zealand. At this point, there was cases happening all over the place. There was a case in New Zealand for SMS Blaster. It was specifically for banks. It was spoofing a bank for some type of fraud. And here I'll mention something that I forgot to mention. Once you are sending an SMS from an SMS Blaster, you control the entire payload. So you can spoof the sender message. You can spoof a lot of things. Not that it's hard to spoof the sender of an SMS when you send it over the network. It's also possible with certain techniques. But in this case, it's very easy. And in the case of New Zealand, they were spoofing a bank. This was another case in Kuala Lumpur, in which I believe this was the first time that I realized about a trend, which is that it's not always the fraudster itself, the one that is driving these cars or carrying these devices. In many cases, what they do is they just pay people very little money to drive this thing around the city or around different places. So the people who get arrested are not really the fraudsters themselves, but the people that they are paying to drive around. But this one was a very large case in Kuala Lumpur. I remember, there's a number here, 642 SIM boxes. It was like this was a tremendous scale and like huge losses from this. This was very interesting one in Bangkok. It was the first time that we saw one of these cases in which the device was being carried in a backpack, but essentially this was a couple of like scammers. I think that they were not the fraudsters themselves. They had paid money to these people, but they were walking around a shopping mall, a very crowded shopping mall in Thailand. And this one, there's a very interesting talk from the CISO of a Thai carrier that explains how that Thai carrier collaborated with law enforcement. And like, I think within a couple of hours from first seeing evidence of these, they were able to like go to the mall and arrest these people, like using antennas and like being able to track these radios. So if you have a chance, I really recommend that you see that presentation. It's a very interesting story of how like carriers collaborated with law enforcement to stop one of these cases. And it was impressive. Like within a couple of hours, they went from like the first, piece of evidence of this, that it was happening in real time, to like police showing up at the mall and arresting these people. So I'm going to pause here and let this simmer in. Maybe people here are wondering now, like, how is this different? Like, how does this matter? Given that this is just SMS phishing, if you're thinking this sounds like a very highly sophisticated, complicated, expensive way to do phishing, but it's just phishing, you're thinking, well, like there's nothing necessarily very different from phishing. It's just like a new way of sending phishing messages that we hadn't seen before, that abuses this type of technology that 10-15 years ago, this was expensive technology. You would only see these either in like very highly sophisticated targeted attacks against at-risk users or politicians or like dissidents or things like that, or like these are tools that like law enforcement uses in lawful scenarios. But with everything else in technology, these devices have become more and more affordable. So right now, anybody who is in the business of fraud can easily buy one of these devices. And I'll explain shortly, but they can recover their investment very, very quickly and make a lot of profit with these devices. Arguably more, there's not really good metrics or numbers or data that we can use to prove this, but arguably we believe that people can make more money with this type of fraud than like just sending standard SMS phishing messages. It just depends on like how broad the fraud case is when you're just sending standard phishing messages. So this is, if from all the slides here, this is the main takeaway point that I would like folks in this call to take home. This is why this is a big deal. This is why this keeps happening. This is why I believe it will keep happening. And this is why I believe that it's happened a lot. We've just seen like the tip of the iceberg because of the things that like the news reports. This is essentially comparing traditional SMS phishing with an SMS Blaster. In traditional SMS phishing, you have one single advantage. One, if you're the fraudster, you can send the messages from the sofa in your apartment, and you can send them anywhere in the world. That's the only advantage you have. Everything else are disadvantages that reduce your return of investment. Messages can be filtered and blocked by the carrier because they travel the carrier network. The moment, I mean, it's more complex than this the way it works, and I'm sure there's a lot of experts on this and in this webinar right now. But essentially, if I get a phishing message, I can report it to the carrier, and then the carrier will see, can use different signatures, can use the link in the message, for example, can use the content, can use different things to essentially inject the rule on their filters and then block all subsequent messages from the same campaign. So you send messages from the sofa in your apartment to anywhere in the world, but after a few messages, the moment a couple of people report a message, they start blocking you, and you have to change the content of the message. You have to start changing things. Only a small percentage of messages, very small percentage of messages, reach a user because of filters, because of like networks have very sophisticated and carriers have very sophisticated anti-fraud messages. And now with AI, even more, you have different systems and processes that inspect messages that if there's a link, they can go to the link and see that it's a malicious link. So it is not trivial anymore to just like bypass these filters and reach a user. Most importantly, of all the challenges that you have if you're sending phishing from anywhere in the world, is that sending messages to what's known as the gray space was already 10, 15 years ago and is today still one of the main triggers for fraud at carriers. The gray space is essentially a phone number that is not assigned to anybody. There are phone numbers that exist, but they are not assigned to anybody. Maybe it's like a T-Mobile number, but it doesn't belong to any subscriber at this point. If somebody is seen sending a lot of SMSs to a lot of numbers that don't belong to anybody, this is a strong indication that they're either blasting random numbers or they got a database of numbers compromised. It's essentially one of the main triggers to detect a fraud. You need to have a list of numbers to message for traditional phishing, or you just like randomly send to messages. And I mean, people still click on these things, but another important thing here is that the payload is generic. You get like the classic FedEx package stuck in customs, IRS scam. I get so many from IRS scams and things like that. So in the end, they get a return on the investment, but it's a diminishing return on investment. And it's getting harder and harder and harder to make money with traditional SMS phishing. With an SMS Blaster, everything are advantages except the fact that you cannot send the messages from the sofa in your living room. Except that people still operate these fraud campaigns from their sofa in their living room. They pay very little money to people to drive around these devices in their cars or in a backpack. So here it's marked as a disadvantage that you need to have physical proximity, but actually what we've seen, like the true stories and the coverage we've seen on these things, is that fraudsters are still doing this and operating these campaigns from their sofa in their apartment. Now, in terms of advantages, 100% of messages will reach a user. Anything that connects to this false base station, it's a smartphone, and you'll send it a message and it will reach the device. So you guarantee that everybody will receive an SMS, everybody, in what is called radio range. So like any device that connects to this network will get the text messages. You will never, ever send a message to the gray space because there's no concept of gray space here. You're just sending messages to phones from people who are around you. the messages cannot be blocked by the carrier because essentially the messages do not go through the carrier. The carrier doesn't see them. The carrier doesn't learn anything. Cannot write filters or signatures for their scan detection engines. And also, very importantly, I alluded to this earlier, is that you can customize the payload. You could go to like Mall of America on July 4th, and the message would be Happy 4th of July, welcome to Mall of America. Click here to redeem your $50 gift card for being today. So you see the text here. Like, I guarantee you that with this payload, sending these on July 4th in this mall, you would get way more people clicking on it than if you send it to random people all over the world. So in the end, they get a much higher return on investment. So, and I'm starting to wrap up here so we can have time for questions. This is a highly profitable form of fraud that telcos cannot really prevent or filter. So what can we do? There's a lot of things that we can do, and I'll talk at the end about something that GSMA published, I think, about a year ago. But I just wanted to share a little bit of like my thoughts on this here. There is a common misconception. People think that if you live in a country where there's like no 2G or 2G is being sunset, or if you're a carrier that doesn't have 2G, that your subscribers are safe from this. This is not true. It's not true, essentially. Accelerating the sunset of 2G globally, it is a positive thing, and we should make sure that we do that. But it's not going to solve these or any other attacks in cybersecurity, things like IMSI catchers or things like that. I always used the same example when talking with executives, when talking with in conferences, when talking with everybody to explain this. And now with AI, I can actually finally draw a picture of it. My example was always the same thing. Imagine that we all went on a mission to Mars, which is pretty cool. Mars is a place where, as far as I know, there's no 2G service. So you can say that 2G is fully sunset in Mars. However, if I bring a 2G false base station on that mission to Mars, and you all are carrying your phones in your pockets, I guarantee you that your phones will connect to that 2G base station. So it doesn't matter whether there's 2G or there's no 2G. What matters is that the device supports 2G, and therefore will connect to a 2G false base station. So again, accelerating sunset of 2G globally is important. We should continue doing it, and it's very correlated to this specific type of fraud, but this is not a solution. So what are the things that we can do? For consumers and users, obviously the standard precaution with suspicious messages should apply here. We should all be leveraging fraud protection features that we have in all major OSs. I'm familiar with the ones in Android because of where I used to work, but there's also very, very strong features in iOS that help you, that minimize the risk of you clicking on things like that. There is a feature in Android that allows you to disable 2G for security. These devices require 2G to operate. They require 2G to send the payload. If your 2G is disabled on the device, you will never get an SMS from a SMS Blaster. So that's a very strong mitigation. However, there is some connectivity impact risk. If you disable 2G and you're in the US, you're going to be fine, not a problem. But if you travel to some area where there's only 2G, your phone will not be able to connect. And trust me, when you're there and you don't know why your phone is not connecting, you might not remember that you have that feature enabled for 2G disabled. So it's important to keep this in mind. That disabling 2G protects you from this, but there could be some connectivity impact. iOS has a similar support for disabling 2G for security as part of lockdown mode. Lockdown mode is a very specific mode for at-risk users that includes some features that protect for extremely rare and sophisticated attacks. So it's not just like you tap there and you disable 2G. It includes many other things. So you should add it here, the links. You should research whether this is something that you want to enable. But if you have it enabled, 2G is disabled, then you cannot receive messages from SMS Blasters. For OEMs, carriers, the industry and whatnot, I could give a lot of recommendations, but I'm just going to refer everybody to the GSMA's SMS Blaster briefing paper. I was one of the authors, but there was a lot of really talented people there and companies involved. And it contains a number of very strong mitigations that can be used. It is not publicly available. If you or your employer are a member of GSMA, you can talk with your liaison and get access there. Another way of mitigating this for the industry would be to adopt RCS and other IP-based messaging platforms. So eventually, SMS becomes unnecessary. Although that would be a good thing, I see it hard. There's always going to be a long tail of devices or use cases in which you'll need SMS. SMS, for example, among many other things, is used in cases of like emergency when you need to alert people in like a given location that there's something bad happening. Very local. This is not like a presidential alert or like an Amber alert. This is more something local to like maybe a college campus, sadly. These things go over SMS. But if we were able to transition everything to IP-based messaging platforms and SMS became unnecessary, that would definitely help here. And then I have this rule of thumb that I like to tell people that it's if you see an SMS, and again, SMS here I'm referring to an actual SMS, not an RCS message, nothing IP-based, just an actual SMS, and it comes over to G, it is quite likely going to be fraud. If you see an SMS and it comes over to G, and your cipher is null, it's like guaranteed to be fraud. There's no use cases for this. This is what an SMS Blaster does. An SMS forces your device to 2G, disables the cipher, sends you an SMS payload. So this is kind of my rule of thumb of how to know whether this is fraud or not. I'm leaving here a bunch of reading in case people are interested about this topic, so you can learn more. And again, I'm going to strongly recommend here that if you do have access to it, reach out to your GSMA liaison and ask them to get you a copy of the SMS Blaster briefing paper. It contains a lot of details on the way they are operated. This thing that I kind of like skim through of how SMS Blasters operate, it's very well analyzed there, and it contains a lot of kind of like things and tell signs from SMS Blasters, like for carriers, for example, to like know what to look for OEMs and whatnot. So it's definitely a very good resource in this topic.